Hi, everybody. Welcome to From the Heart. I'm Liz Walker. All week, we've been reviewing some of the most healing conversations that we've had in 2025. And today, we circle back to a fascinating talk with Dr. Jules Harrell. He is a professor of psychology at Howard University. And we talked about his study of the physiology of racism. Take a look. Dr. Harrell, welcome. Thanks for
Good to
joining.
see you. So good to see you.
Before we move any further, I think I have a general understanding on this whole idea of racism and stress, but explain to me how this cardiovascular physiology plays into all of this. What is that?
You know, and that's an interesting question because it takes us even further back than my history at Howard. It takes us way back to the middle part of the 18th century. Charles Darwin proposed that the brain and the heart were linked together. And through something we'll talk about probably before the night's over, called the vagus nerve. Darwin was aware, people were aware of this vagus nerve, which is it's in it's sort of at the base of the brain there, the 10th cranial nerve, and it serves organs as low as our intestines, lower intestines, all the way up through the larynx, and it includes the heart. And what Darwin suspected was that some of the emotions that we go through, some of the emotional kinds of experiences we feel them in the heart through this vagus nerve. And that's really a lot of things going on in the areas of medicine and in the area of physiology now center around this vagus nerve. The idea I'm trying to get across is that even before psychology started up, we were aware that the cardiovascular system and emotions and behavior were all linked together.
All connected,
yes,
all
indeed.
connected. Well, I didn't know that. And I think that's a beautiful description or a definition of the vagus nerve, because I've heard about that,
Yes.
but I never got the link. So thanks a lot. I imagine when we discuss the symptoms of this physiology of racism and racism related stress, we're talking about tell us what are the symptoms. Tell us what areas we're talking about here. I mentioned to a couple of weakened immune system, but how far does this go?
I think what you want to do is this, and this is a physician I met years and years ago from Baltimore, Calvin Sinnett, his name was, and he said, when you think of racism, think about it in terms of the way you would think of malnutrition. When somebody is malnourished, when people are going through malnourishing kinds of experience, just assume that every system in the body is going to be affected by it. And when we think of racism, that's how we have to consider this thing. Is we thought, well, years ago we'd say, well, it's just the cardiovascular system, or it's just maybe some cortisol kinds of things, these types of restricted kinds of effects. But what we're finding now is that the entire system can be impacted by racism and its effects. So I use it sort of a parallel to what goes on when we think of somebody being malnourished. So there's the diseases, of course, the ones we think about would be the cardiovascular diseases.
Right.
The diseases like some of the intestinal diseases are in fact controlled by the same systems, what we call the autonomic system, and there's activity going on there. But then we find out that these diseases that we think are purely, say, related to being aroused or arousal, they may in fact be tied in with the immune system also. So the whole system is going to be impacted by racism.
Wow, that's amazing. Your focused research, and I understand you've developed a cutting edge laboratory research technique into this. How does one do research on these kinds of issues?
That was really interesting. Again, I was really concerned with anxiety disorders and with what in the old days, they called them psychosomatic disorders. My dear sister had severe asthma. And we knew that there were certain aspects of asthma that were related to anxiety and arousal and those kinds of things. And so I think what happened when I got to Howard, I said, well, we can now, because we have a hospital and we have physicians around, we can now study these things in the laboratory. But how do we import something like racism into the laboratory? And we had two things that were operating back then. One is that a lot of people that were doing stress research used stressful films. They would take there was one called if they wanted to arouse or make a person upset, they would show them a picture of a careless workman, somebody not following. And at the end of the thing, of course, they receive a bad injury, and you study their physiology as this bad event gets closer. So we had the notion of filming, and then the other thing we had is that in the area of anxiety treatment, people were using emotional imagery. When you imagine a situation very vividly, a lot of the physiological changes you would get if you were in that situation will occur when you imagine it. So if somebody is a snake phobic, if you have them imagine a snake crawling up their arm, they will show you the same kinds of some of the arrays of physiological responses you would see if the snake was actually there. So what we said is that, well, through imagery and through film, careful use of those things, we can import racism into the lab and study physiology as that occurs. Now, that's in the early days. That's how we were approaching it.
That really touches me because I know I was just talking about before we decided to go on tonight. I was telling you about reading a book and
Yes.
getting the visual image from Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of
Yes.
Other Suns when she tells the story of some of the experiences of people way back in
Yes.
time and how that hit me viscerally. But maybe it hit me even more so
It did.
in the experiences because I felt I had to stop reading after a minute because it was so deep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Reverend Liz, what I ended up doing when I finished Warmth of Other Suns is I wrote her a note and said, I feel like I've lost 3 dear friends, because you at the end, toward the end, not spoiler alert, but toward the end, we see these people toward the end of their lives, but it felt that real. It felt that real to me, and that's the thing. That the brain can recapture these situations, play them back for us, and physiologically, you will see changes associated with those.
Unbelievable. Were there what was the biggest surprise for you as you've done this 45 years? And maybe there have been many surprises. Have there been in this research?
I think what surprised me, and I should not have been surprised by this, but I'll just say it out loud. The role of young people in keeping your ideas fresh in this area. That the young people are experiencing across those years, we're experiencing racism in different forms. Now, racism takes a variety of forms that we can talk about, but those sort of wax and wane across the years. And so they would say, okay, let's work with this. So I think I had underestimated the role that students, Howard University students would play in changing what we were actually looking at and the kinds of things we were going after in this thing.
Can you example that, an easy example, or is it all pretty complicated?
No. Well, it's not. For example, the movement we went from, when people think of racism, they think of individual racism a lot. That's an easy one. And institutional forms a little less. But one of our students really pushed me to this idea of studying what we call structural racism. How racism sort of manifests itself in what we call racialized outcomes, prison rates, unemployment, those kinds of things. And those things are not due to one particular event in society. That's due to a whole bunch of things converging and causing people to wind up in jail or causing people to, to have less wealth than another group might have. And students showed me how, in fact, we could sort of talk about those things in terms of vivid portrayals of these things in actual visual representations of these things in the lab as racialized outcomes. And that involved us bringing in people from a variety of areas. But when you think of incarceration differences between Black males and white males, all right, you can actually depict that graphically and show it in such a way that you can make it more real to an individual and study physiology as they go through that. And that was our way of sort of moving into what we call the structural racism phenomena, not just simply people not being refused an apartment or people being called a name. No, this is something a little bit more complicated. That's all students that work with that.
Well, that really adds a depth to this debate that we're going through right now. The whole idea of systematic or systemic, wrong word, systemic racism and structural racism. Those who say that is not true, but it's not just a social thing. That can go even deeper, is what your students are saying, right?
Yes, that's right. Dr. Tanisha Bufford, who's now teaching at North Carolina Central, really would push us on that, and as a student. And I think she had a strong sociology background, and sociologists were aware of this a long time ago. It's just that you have to think about, okay, what does this do to a person psychologically to see that, in fact, when they pan the prison population, everybody in there looks like them or their uncle or their aunt, and those kinds of things. How do you bring that into the laboratory? And once you're able to sort of be, sort of creative with that, then I think you've opened up the door to move past just the individual manifestations, which are bad enough. Individual manifestations of racism bad enough and can be traumatic enough, but there are also these more subtle forms that are out here, and they
Now,
lead to these outcomes.
one issue that I don't think gets enough attention now, when I, again, back to this book, and it's so funny that I would start reading this book. I'm reading it just to get some research of our history.
Yes.
But she writes about this notion of how parents beat children. This is in one of the stories that she tells. And but the beating of the children is not just discipline, it's what the parents have experienced.
That's right.
And then, and then manifests itself in how they treat their children. And I was thinking about this notion of internal oppression, internal, what racism does to us on the inside. Is that something that's in the purview of your research, or is that something you think about?
All the time, and we'll say this again, is that sometimes our poets help us out. Robert Hayden, an African-American poet who was at University of Michigan for years, but he goes back to the 40s and the 30s and with Gwendolyn Brooks and those individuals. He has a poem, a beautiful poem. It's a sad poem about a woman beating, and it starts out, the woman across the street is beating her child again. And the last line in this thing is that she's basically beating that child for all the beatings that life has given her. But he says it's a poetic kind of a presentation he gives of this thing. And what it makes you see is that, in fact, these are very complicated kinds of internalizations that occur. And sometimes it's because of certain events, and the person doesn't realize, I'm angry with this child because I didn't get that job, or because somebody, was rude to me, or whatever. My life has not been what I thought it would be, but it still manifests in those ways, and we have to be aware of that.
I would argue that, and again, not a revelation, we all know this. This is the same thing we see on the streets sometimes when young males are up against each other and treat each other brutally. Young black males in the community, that's part of that internalized oppression.
Yes.
Which Bell Hooks has always talked about in her writing. Is that something that we can do scientifically and research and look at that?
That's really, and maybe we could have started at this point I'm going to make now, is that what you find in any of the studies we're doing is vast individual differences in the way people respond. And sometimes the individual differences are rooted in the kinds of experiences. Sometimes they're rooted in personality. Sometimes they're rooted in specific experiences an individual has had. And sometimes it's rooted in the coming together of both of those things, both the person's personality and the experiences. So it's all mixed up in there. But people will differ radically in terms of how they will respond. Some individuals will say, look, I'm going to walk away from this fight. Others are sort of quick to jump in, any little insult. And they're ready because they're right at that edge, of anger related to some of these internalized racisms that we see out here.
As a scientist, as a researcher, when you're doing all of this, Dr. Harrell, how does it affect you emotionally? Do you have to step away, or can you remove yourself and just look at this from some kind of objective scientific lens?
I think that it hurts. It's painful to see some of the things that you see, and to observe these. For example, when a young man comes in, and I see them right at the edge of being hypertensive, and they're 19 years old. I mean, that's very early, and we know that we're seeing now one of the sequelae, or one of the things that follows behind hypertension or high blood pressure, is kidney disease. Kidney disease tied up in this thing, and a variety of other issues. And you see this and you say, well, look, if this individual continues to be so hyper responsive to a racist environment that they're in, they're going to be very ill by the time they reach their 40s, And so that hurts, because I always think of, my own father was 46 when he had a fatal heart attack. So you say, okay, now how do we break this? How do we break this kind of a cycle that we're in now of poor health outcomes related to various forms of racism and related to other things that are going on in the society? So yeah, that keeps, and I just sort of turn around and say, well, that motivates you to keep moving. You have to take that as a form of motivation. You cannot sulk. You know, you've been granted these years, 45 of them at a university. How many people in the world get that kind of, that kind of blessing to be able to ask these kinds of questions, even though they're painful, and seek answers? That's something to really be appreciative of, that opportunity.
One of the reasons we started the program Can We Talk was
Yes.
that regular, ordinary people could get some of the answers that you're getting. Because I remember, thinking about my own father who died at 51, so just
There you
like
go.
your father, and died of a stroke.
Yep.
And I know, looking back now
Mhm.
and having learned about trauma and all the things my father went through, it had to have some
Yeah.
impact on him. It couldn't have just been that he ate too much salt. You know what
No,
I mean?
no, no.
It is in our past. And so what I guess I'm saying is the work you're doing is really important, because now you're helping me pass on this
Yes.
information to regular folks. So don't grow weary, I guess is
No,
what.
no, 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 no. But but
And I sound like you are, but I just want to
no.
remind you how important this really is. Let me take a second here to say, if there's
Yes.
someone out there who wants to join us in conversation, in typing in, we would love to hear of your experiences with racism. We have somebody right now, Kathleen Burns Power says, this is how trauma is passed on from one generation to another. So I see you nod and you agree with that, correct?
Yes, yes, yes.
It,
Um,
it's in our DNA in some ways, huh?
yeah, and this is something that we really have to take very seriously. We do not enter the world blank slates. That was an old notion a long time ago, that we come in here and then experience begins to write on us. No, these things that have happened will impact us even prenatally. There's a rich area of research going on that it's been at least 20 years out there now, and it's called fetal programming. And it really centers around the idea that sometimes because of what goes on in that uterine environment, stress hormones, those kinds of things, as well as nutritional issues, it causes us to be all right at birth, but we're programmed for diseases later on down the line. They found this out looking at some World War II data of women who were deprived in some of the Scandinavian countries of nutrition during pregnancy. And the child looks all right, but then later on down the line, they see new diseases. So things can be passed on in terms of stress hormones. They can be passed on in terms of early learning, that kind of thing. And it does make racism and stress intergenerational in this outcome.
So we're just at the very beginning, or where are we in the research now? How do you look at that?
I wish I was starting now, because we
Wow.
have all of the. I wish I was starting, and I tell students that they have all of these types of. They have not only physical instruments that they can do, to watch the brain as it's stressed, or watch the brain as it recovers. But they have mathematical models, and they have interdisciplinary teams that have come together now all over. Hopefully, we're not going to stop all of that stuff with current issues. But that type of research, it's so important, and we're right at the beginnings of knowing how this system works.
Wow, that's amazing and very, very, very exciting. Let's turn the page just a little bit. I
Yeah,
wanted to
yeah.
talk about the students that you deal with, the students overall at Howard University. This is not a question that I said I was going to ask. So I know you'll be able to answer it. Talking about the stresses of the times, let's say, and so a new group of kids comes to school with all the hope and the idealism and all the dreams. What kind of stresses do you see on any particular year of new students, or do you?
Oh gosh, yes, and people talk about, well, in my day we had to walk, uphill to school both ways, and that. No, these students have been through some stuff. They've been through some. This is the students we're seeing currently are the ones. A lot of them had no prom, had no graduation. They're COVID students.
Right,
But
right.
even prior to that, what we have several scholarship programs in the department, and students will write for these, and we'll kind of talk about some background issues, and when you have the kinds of stresses that are on families now, in terms of just employment just kind of making ends meet. And then we have some bad modeling out there in terms of television of what a relationship should be about. These things are going to reverberate down to the children. And some of these young people have seen things in their homes and seen the kinds of conflicts that should not be seen by anyone, anywhere, ever, but certainly not by young people. So I'm seeing what I find is that we might be underestimating the resilience of some of these young people that are out there, because you read some of the biographies and you say, how are they still standing? How are they still standing through that? And they are, and maybe that's intergenerational too. Maybe it's some of that stuff that allowed our mothers and fathers to stand as they did, to stand their ground and stand up. But they are really, there's some very, very resilient young people out there. And there's some people that have been through some things that are just unimaginable in terms of events.
Oh my gosh. Oh my God. But that's scary. How does social media fit into all of this? I mean, I know that social media has the best of things, but I also worry about social media for these young people because they spend so much time on it. Do you look at it as both or do you look at it as negative? How do you look at as far as our emotional and physiological, response to trauma?
This is really going back a long ways, but I look at social media the way that people talked about the CB radio maybe 30 or 40 years ago. Truckers used to have these CB radios that and the citizens band radio is what it was, and they could talk to one another on the road, you remember those things, and they could talk and chat. But some years ago, this is maybe 20 years back, there was an international study on the impact of loneliness on physiology. And one of the major researchers, a guy named John Cacioppo, made a point about what they were finding is that for lonely people, social media is no substitute for the interpersonal kind of interaction that we need. That it's there, it's something that is entertaining, it's something, you reach out to people, but it's not going to take the place of that human interpersonal contact that I think the nervous system was sort of structured to encounter, that our nervous systems are set up so that we can read the expressions of one another. We can kind of sense the moods of one another. And I don't know I don't know, we might be expecting too much from social media to think it's going to take the place of that. People need they need that contact.
We need contact with each other. And in some ways, social media makes us even lonelier because of the bullying and all of the negativity that can come. I don't envy the young people. I know that there's so many benefits of social media, but I don't envy them at all with the negativity that goes on there. And we already have enough problems. One of the things I've always believed, and I'm rethinking this belief, so you can help, is that it's not just racism that's the problem. It's the perception of racism. That even if my son and I talk about this all the time, when I walk in the store to this day, I will try to hold my purse in a way that you can see I'm not stealing anything, which is a really sad state. And I said, well, Nick, I'm not even sure if people are paying attention to that. That's what I carry. And he said, well, Mom, it doesn't matter whether it's the perception or the reality, still you carrying it. Yeah. What do you think there? Is that detrimental? I mean, I know it's detrimental. How detrimental is that?
Yeah, and again, I think of a line that Frantz Fanon, a psychiatrist from the 50s and 60s, made this notion, put the notion out there for Black people. Is sometimes every hand's a losing hand. If you walk in there too naively, without that sort of coping response that you set up, to kind of say, okay, I'm straight here. Nothing's going on here. If you walk in there naively, the consequences are bad also, So you say, well, I'm paranoid because something could be, something could go wrong. You're paranoid, right? Yeah, that's right. There's nothing wrong with that. So I think that what we want to say is that we have developed a series of coping mechanisms and responses, especially to racism. Some of them are protective, but there's certainly consequences to it. Just an example on this is that when I first came to Howard, I came up in the summer to work in the area of high blood pressure. And an individual who had set up what they call the Hypertension Control Center at Howard, this was a physician, brought in a lot of grant money and really worked hard to get this thing up. And he passed away shortly after the thing was opened as a young man. And what we were looking at in psychophysiology at that time was that sometimes actively coping with your environment, actively trying to control these things and get stuff together, that can make the stress response even worse.
Wow.
And it's what we call the flight-fight system. Sometimes kicks in, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in because of you're striving for control, you're striving to master this stuff. So we've got to always be careful of the coping procedures that we use, some of which have very good outcomes, but they may have, they may be a two-edged sword.
Right. Just try to be resilient takes a lot of strength.
That's right.
Wow. You have one of the most popular classes, I'm told, on Howard's campus. So tell me about that class. What is it?
The class is called, there's a class called Race and Racism that we teach at the undergraduate and the graduate level now. There's a graduate section of that. And basically what it does is deal with this concept of race and sort of dismisses it because biologically it doesn't make sense for human beings to be divided into races. Birds, you can do that too. And because they have separate species separate subspecies of birds. So that works, but not for humans. We haven't been around that long. So we deal with the whole idea of race, and then we try to look at racism for how it manifests today, but we try to set it up so no discipline is going to have, the last say. So in other words, for the biologists come in there very early on talking about what's going on in terms of the genetic work on race or whatever, or what people trying in that area. The sociologists will come in, people in communications will come in because there's so much going on in the, in that environment. So I think that the one thing that we've always tried to do with that is not prioritize what's going on in psychology, but talk about it as a student's attempt to really look at racism from an interdisciplinary point of view after you dismiss the notion of race as a viable concept. One of the things I really hate to see, and you hear it all the time, is people will say, well, so-and-so wasn't allowed to do this because of their race. All right. It wasn't because of their race. It was because of racism. They were not able to do that. And we want students to really understand the difference between those two statements and to really rail against the idea of saying, okay, there is a biological event here that we're talking about. No, we're talking about a social practice and a political practice and an economic practice. All of these things, they come together to result in people in disadvantaged or powerless situations. So I think that may account for some of the popularity as we try to let these different disciplines, show what they have to offer us, and that includes the humanities and certainly history in those areas too.
I find that very uplifting because, in these times when there's so much fear, and we're not going to get into the political thing, but clearly we're living in a time of great fear and great trauma about what you can talk about. That's and right. What words will not be allowed and what institutions. Certainly Howard is not going to be immune from that. I'm sure if they haven't already come at you in some ways, because anybody who gets federal funds, but it's uplifting to know that I would wonder almost, and maybe this is not a psychological question, it's almost like we're doing more conversation about this because of the political climate right now. Would you agree?
Yeah, and again, you put that in context with the kinds of things we were coming out of with the pandemic, with all of that violence in terms of the police violence and that kind. We were seeing that people were confronting that head on. And then being told that, you can't talk about racism anymore. Wait a minute, you can't say that, especially now.
Right.
Especially now. That's just ludicrous for you to even think we're going to back off of this stuff. So,
Right. I mean, we are too far into this. That same conversation, though, that same kind of not resilience, that resistance in that way also gives me hope in our resilience of getting through these times, because we've been through some. All you got to do is read the warmth of other suns, and you Well, no, and I'm not being paid to promote this book
No,
several years after she wrote it. But my point is, we've been through some stuff.
that's right.
And when you say our young people are, still very much in this and want to deal with this and get their own resistance, I find that very hopeful as well.
Yeah, and
Um,
you just have the thing you have to recognize is they will not be clones of us. They will look at things somewhat differently. There'll be differences, and but at the same time, when you go to the core of what they're saying, it's an extension of what was being said, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, a century ago in the Black community.
well, they can't be clones of us because
That's
you
right.
have to take this to another level. You got to add some new weapons in this arsenal.
That's right.
About to get some serious stuff here. One of the things I'm most excited about, and I wanted to tell the people, and Micah, I know you're there and you hear us. If there's any other statements that people you want to share with us, I don't know. I can't see from here if other people are connecting with us. We'd love for you to connect and bring us your own stories, your own thoughts on this. If not, we will continue on because this is a fascinating conversation with Dr. Harrell. But Dr. Harrell, one of the things I'm very excited about is that we are partnering with Howard coming up this fall and in the future to deal with the issue of continuing to talk about the pain of trauma from all origins, including the origin of race. Or racism. Let me get that straight. Not race, but racism. That's something I learned right there. What would you say would be the need of young students coming in? We talked about some of the things they bring in and their resilience. What would their need be in terms of talking about it, having these collective conversations about the pain that we are all going through these days?
Number one, what you said before, is it? I think they have to be around the same table. I've taught these online courses, and I've taught remotely a little bit during COVID, and it's not the same thing. We cannot allow our meetings to be Zoom meetings if we can help it. If we can bring smaller groups into an area where they can see one another, and they can say, well, I used to see you walking there, but I never knew that had happened to you. Those kinds of things, and they can read one another's faces and their expressions. I think that's going to be really important. And then the notion of the openness that the trauma treatment groups bring to the idea that, okay, yes, we hear you, and we also share what you've been through. Everybody around the table has been through some things. That's going to, I think, really going to be the key thing, is just to bring them physically into an area where they can see one another and be with one another in a very open kind of a way. That's going to be so crucial.
I agree with you. I think it's going to be really important. I think that's been the power of forming communities around this, not to just, air dirty laundry, not to get into each other's business, but the notion of sharing it,
that's right.
Sharing the pain is a way to get collective healing, I believe.
Yes,
so I think
right.
that will definitely happen. So we're looking forward to that. What do you want to happen with your research? What will your research lead to as far as you're concerned?
I think that what we're talking about is we have to put it under the heading of empowerment. We have to empower people to sort of get control, to recognize, number one, the impact of the environment on our physiology, and then to sort of take control of that whole process. Some of it is going to be, if it's just simply saying, I want you to appreciate, it's a wondrous kind of a nervous system we have. The heart and the brain are so interconnected. Little things, just a shift in your attention causes changes and not necessarily a shift into something negative or positive, but just the idea that you've shifted your attention to something. There's a cardiovascular component to that. All of the system, every time your heart beats, every time you have a blood pressure change, there's a system in the body that corrects for that. I'm talking about on the second by second basis. So we want students and people to sort of appreciate this wondrous vehicle God has given us and how intricate it is in terms of its in the interactions among its parts, and then how we would actually get control over some of the negative effects of a racist environment on that system. So to get people to train in meditation, to use music, to use prayer, whatever it is, to sort of calm this system and bring it back into kind of a balanced state if it is in fact interrupted by some, if that balance is interrupted by some form of racism or stress. I want to see people sort of have that control, independent of medication. Sometimes you need the medication, but to have
Absolutely.
that sort of control in the hands of the individual, I would love to see that. Love to see.
Wow. Wow. I think that's going to happen. I think that's beginning to happen now.
Yes.
So your research is already paying off. What's the greatest concern that you have in your, in what you know? What causes you the greatest worry, stress, if you will, from what you're learning?
I think the thing that worries me to this day is this, and you mentioned it earlier, this notion of internalized racism, the notion, what does racism do to our minds? What does it make us think about ourselves? Because that happens on a couple of levels. There's sort of conscious kinds of what we call schema that we use, schema, just the organizing principles that we use to sort of look at the world. But then there's also a whole series of unconscious processes that are going on here too. And some of those are conditioned, some of those are just sort of deep-seated types of things. And to change these things, to change these internalization problems that we have, or the way that racism writes on our brains, to change those, people say, well, why are you trying to encroach on my freedom? Why I can think what I want about this, or I can call ugly whoever I want to call ugly. Well, no, sometimes you're reflecting racism in the way that in what you see as ugly. And I think that if we back off of these really critical questions about how racism makes us think, then we're going to be another 50 or 60 years in the same boat. We've got to be willing to take on and say, hey, look, there are things in that racist environment that we internalize that we can no longer accept and find acceptable. It's interesting. I was watching something, and this is really my problem with sports. If you put in Muhammad Ali and do an image of that Google, for example, and you hit image, what you'll see is Muhammad Ali. The first one that pops up, at least a month ago, is Muhammad Ali standing over Sonny Liston with his arm, and Sonny Liston laying on his back. A black man standing over another black man down, and that's the most popular picture of Muhammad Ali. Some people have never seen any picture of Muhammad Ali except that one. And that to me that's back to this whole idea of internalizing these processes, some of these racist processes that are out there, because it's all right for black men to do that, fight one another, to find the picture of when all the group of black men got together with Muhammad Ali, and they included people like Jim Brown, Bill Russell, Kareem Jabbar, a whole series of men, and talked to him about what he was doing in terms of his stand. That picture is harder to get a hold of.
Wow.
And so I'm saying that's what I'm worried about, is how do we correct these images? How do we correct what's in here when we've got on the outside this negative stuff still coming in?
Wow. Okay. Conversely, what gives you the greatest hope of what you've seen and done? And maybe you've talked about it in bits and pieces throughout this interview, but how would you conclude the hope that you find?
There's so many avenues for hope, but one that I don't want to neglect is the impact of the arts. And by the arts, I'm talking about the fine arts area, the music, what's going on in painting, what's going on in playwriting. All right. That the people in the arts are able to sort of pull together a lot of the things we find in science or whatever it is, and then make it come to life. They bring life to it. And so, I think of August Wilson's 10-play series that he wrote, 10 plays. And he said, look, I want to reflect Black life in the United States over that last century, the one we just came out of. And you can go to those things and say, wow, this comes to life, and I understand it at a deeper level. So I think the arts and the writers and that aspect of things, there's so much hope there. And of course, the musicians are out there, the people in music. All of these areas are there to sort of breathe life into us, as these sorrow songs and the spirituals did when we were in the field, And that's still there. That's still part of who we are. Even though there's a strong attempt of business to get a hold of our artists and to pollute that art,
Right.
it's still the music survives, the art survives, and I think that's where the real hope is.
Well, I just want you to know that gives me hope, but what gives me even greater hope
Yes.
is you, Doctor, because to know that you've been working on this for 45 years, to just be able to share some of the information that you have discovered and you're passing on, that's what we need. We need to get educated. So thank you. Thank you so much for being on today. Thank you. And
I've enjoyed every moment of it. Every minute.
Absolutely. Well, I hope we can get back together again another time. Okay. Dr.
We'll
Harrell from Howard University, who is the physiology of racism, but also maybe even the physiology of hope. Thanks for joining us. Right. And thank you all for being here tonight. We'll see you again from the heart. Bye, everybody. Now, remember, in 2026, we're going to continue our healing conversations on From the Heart at noon, twice a month. We'll keep you posted on when that begins, but we want you with us because together we can all heal. Thanks for joining us, everybody.